me the story of Jesus, right from my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Love in that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read while you whisper, love came the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Okay. I believe this is number 6. This will be our hopefully this will be our last lesson on this. And then I intend to start a series on why the King James Bible probably next week, assuming that I can get that will be one that we actually have a PowerPoint. And so as long as I can make sure and have all of that together, that technology stuff together, then I'll start that series next week. As I just said a couple of minutes ago, I've been picking on women long enough, so now it's time for me to start picking on the guys. We've covered a lot of aspects, and I don't want to take all the time to try to review all of it, because then we wouldn't have any time left this morning. But there is one thing that I want to cover. It's not in the outline, but it's extremely important that we understand, because it's something that we bump up against, not just on this position, but on just about every position that we run into. Many times you'll be talking to someone and a wife will say, well, I'm not going to submit to my husband until I understand why I have to. And that's not the way that things work in God's world. God commands that you submit first, and then He'll give you the understanding. You submit to whatever position it is that He's required you to do, and then you'll gain the understanding in it. With God's doctrine, it is not a head thing. It's not, you cannot study God's doctrine like you would any other theory or anything else. You can't do it that way. You have to get the understanding from God directly. I want you to turn to Proverbs chapter 2 and look at a few words in just a little bit of this passage, because it's essential that you understand that the way you understand the Bible is not with your head. It is with your heart. God does not judge your mind. He doesn't look at your mind. He looks at your heart. And so sometimes, I haven't had the experience myself, but I've heard of it, where someone just absolutely refuses to submit to what they know God wants them to do until they understand it. And they've got the cart in front of the horse, because you cannot understand it until God sees that you are willing to submit. You know how many times I read Ephesians chapter 1 before I finally converted? The first time I heard it, I've told you this story, the first time I heard it was in a Pentecostal church, and they pulled the preacher off the stage and he was gone, never saw him again, just because he read that passage. Well, I kept going back to that thing over and over and over again for the course of almost 10 years, looking at it, wondering, what in the world can that be? I know what it says, but it can't mean that. There's no way in the world it can possibly mean that. It's got to mean something else. And so I adopted the old theory, well, God chooses you based on your foreseen whatever, okay? And for years I went along with that, but that passage bothered me and bothered me and bothered me. It wasn't until I finally fell down to my knees and said, God, I don't care anymore. Show me what the truth is and I'll do it. And the next day, it came crystal clear to me. That's what's required to understand God's doctrine. It's not done by trying to understand it first and then submitting to it. It's understood by submitting to it and letting God give you the understanding. In Proverbs chapter 2, it says, "My son, if thou wilt receive my words." You've got to have a will to receive them. You've got to be willing to receive what he says. "If thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee." Now, I'm getting older, and so I tend to hide things and then lose them. But the whole idea behind hiding things is to not lose them. The reason we put things in a safe is so they're safe, so we don't lose them. And as long as I stick stuff in the safe, I'm okay, because I know where the safe is and I can't lose it. It's too big. Okay? But my keys, I always have to put them in exactly the same place, because if they go anywhere else, they're lost. But he wants you to have a will for the things of God and to keep them, to hang on to them, not just hear them once and let them go, but hide my commandments with thee. Hang on to them. "So that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom." You've got to be willing to listen to something new. You've got to be willing to open your ears up and listen and pay attention and apply. Now watch this. "Apply thine heart to understanding." Does it say apply thine mind? No. It says apply thine heart to understanding. "Yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding." You got to pray for it. You got to ask for it. You got to do some seeking for it. "If thou seekest her as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." Those are the steps necessary in order to understand God's Word. You can't do it with your brain. You can't. You will not. You might be able to understand the grammar, but you will not understand it the way you need to understand it to walk in God's kingdom. If you want to understand God's Word, you got to be willing to keep God's Word, even if it disagrees with your preconceived ideas of what it ought to be. Because and I know this myself, because until I was willing to, had I not done that, I'd still be looking at Ephesians and thinking it meant something completely different than it does. And it would still be bothering me, because you just can't understand it till God flips the light switch. And if you go too far, he'll flip the switch in the other direction. I say that because some of the things that I've said during the course of this series are kind of hard to take. One of the people out in Las Vegas mentioned the fact when I was talking about getting the leather strap out and biting it because this is going to hurt. Well, sometimes there's times when things are hard to receive. But if God said it, you have to receive it because God said it. I've made this comment before, I'll keep making it. My name is James. It ain't King James. I didn't translate this. I didn't write this book. I'm just delivering to you what it said. So now I'm not going to pick on women anymore, and I'm going to start picking on men. I want you to turn to Ephesians chapter 5. I see a lot of women smiling right now. This is revenge time. I saved the best for last. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. It mentions the fact that no man ever hated himself. What do we call somebody that does bad things to themselves? People that cut their wrists or beat themselves up. We call them crazy, don't we? And yet there are cases where men do that to their wives, maybe not physically, but emotionally. They will create such havoc within the house that they absolutely destroy the emotional well-being of their wives. And when you do that, you're not loving your wife as Christ loved the church. There's more to this than you, guys. There's more to this than satisfying your needs and going out and doing whatever it is that you want to do. If you're going to love your wife even as Christ loved the church, you have to consider what Christ did for this church. And he did more than just demand things from the church. He gave himself for the church. And men, you need to give yourself for your wife. The word love as a verb means to bear love to, obviously, but as a substantive, it means this: that disposition or state of feeling with regard to a person, which arising from recognition of attractive qualities, from instincts of natural relationship, or from sympathy, manifests itself in solicitude for the welfare of the object, and usually also in delight in his presence and desire for his approval, warm affection, attachment. Now that word solicitude is anxious, special, or particular care or attention. Have you ever noticed that when two people find each other and they first start dating, once you get past that, it's been so long ago, once you get past that awkward, well, to give you an example, I woke up yesterday morning to realize that I am the father of a 28-year-old sailor, and he was born a year after we were married. So it's been a while, been a long time since I dated. But after you get past the awkward period of, I can't call her for 2 days, or however that little game is played, and you actually decide that you're going to be boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, you can't stand to not be around them. You always want that person around. Let me give you another example. For those of you that are my age or older and have forgotten all that stuff, if you have a dog, have you ever noticed that when you come home, you've been gone for your walk, you've been out for 2.5 minutes because you went to the mailbox and have come back, and you open the door and the dog's wiggling all over the place, so glad to see you, because to them you've been gone for an eternity. I never thought you'd come home. That's solicitude. That's the way it works. You should care for that person as if you want to be with them all the time. That's what love is. The word welfare is the state or condition of doing or being well. Good fortune, happiness, or well-being of a person, community, or thing, thriving or successful progress in life, prosperity. That's what you should search for. That's what you should want to give your wife. It's extremely important that you understand this. Look at the picture of what Christ did for his church. Do you do the same for your wife? Do you love your wife that much? Because if you don't, you need to learn to. Because that's what Christ tells you to do. Love your wife even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. A husband that truly loves his wife, cares about her welfare, wants to be with her, cares about what she thinks of him, is fond of her, gives her particular attention, is devoted to her happiness and her well-being, and doesn't put her into situations where it's stressful. Life is stressful enough as it is. You don't need to pile on top of it with your weird and crazy wants and desires to cause your wife any more emotional stress than she has to go through raising children or doing whatever it is she has to do. You should be the buffer between the world and your wife. You should take that upon yourself rather than piling it on her. And if you're not doing that, if you're piling things on her, then you do not love your wife as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. You see, the commandment establishes that a man's rule over his wife is to be wielded with a view to to what's good for her, not what's good for you. She should be of paramount importance in your life. Now, I know we're not all perfect at this. That's why I go around apologizing constantly to my wife. And if it wasn't for God's grace, she would have left me a long time ago. But God's gracious. So okay? Nowhere, if you look at the scripture, there is nowhere in the scripture that the rule of the husband can be construed to be some sort of a club to gratify his lust or his power or an excuse to debase or degrade his wife. You can't find that in here. Some men, they look at that and they think that, well, the wife's supposed to be submissive, so she has to do everything I ask her to do, regardless how it might debase or humiliate her. We saw that example out in Las Vegas. That's not the way it's written. That's not love. Authority, I want you to think about this. The authority that the husband has over the wife is for the purpose of edification. Turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. It's for the purpose of edification of the wife. Edification means to build something up. And that's what the authority that the husband has over the wife is intended for. To build the wife up, not to cut her down. 2 Corinthians 10, chapter 10 and verse 8 says, "For though I should boast somewhat more of our authority, which the Lord hath given us for edification, and not for your destruction, I should not be ashamed." You see, in the husband's position, he should be building the wife up. He should be caring for her. Is that not what Christ did for the church? Does he not build the church up? Have you ever seen him tear the church apart? As long as the church is his church and is striving to meet his commandments to the best of their ability, have you ever seen an example of him tearing it down? No. He tries to build it up. And he's the pattern you're to follow. In 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 3, it says, "The God of Israel said, the rock of Israel spake to me, he that ruleth over men must be just." A man that's in the position of authority and under the context that we're talking here of a husband, you have to be just. You have to be fair. You have to consider all points of view before you put your wife in a position that's unwieldy. And you see, a wife needs to know that a husband's authority is being wielded for her good and not for his own ego. And there are way too many marriages where the husband's more concerned with his own ego than he is for his wife. And they usually end in a divorce. Turn to Philemon chapter 1. Well, it's only got one chapter. Turn to Philemon verse 8. Philemon was written by the Apostle Paul to this man named Philemon who had owned a slave by the name of Onesimus. And Onesimus had run away. He'd been converted under the Apostle Paul and had actually been used to deliver letters to different people. But Paul sent him back to Philemon. Okay? And during, we're not going to read the whole letter, but during the course of this letter, he tells Philemon, if he owes you anything, put it on my account. Okay? But he requested that Philemon receive Onesimus back, not punish him, but take him back in as a brother because of what had happened. Because now he's a Christian brother. Please accept this back. But I want you to see the wording that he used in this. In Philemon verse 8, Paul says, "Wherefore, though I might be much bold in Christ to enjoin thee that which is convenient," I could order you to do this, in other words. I could demand that you do this. "Yet for love's sake I rather beseech thee, being such a one as Paul the aged, and now also a prisoner of Jesus Christ." And he goes on to request that he receives him back. You see, as my dad used to always say, you can catch more flies with honey than you can with vinegar. And then my smart aleck attitude was always, well, why would you want to catch flies? I never got that one. But it's true, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Sometimes an appeal to the wife for love's sake is much more preferable than just sticking your foot down and putting your finger in her face and demanding things. Don't treat your wife that way. Christ didn't treat the church that way, did he? Christ's model of service. Now remember, we're comparing Christ with the church to a husband and his wife. Let's not lose sight that that's what we're talking about. We're looking at Christ's example to the church and comparing the husband's relationship with his wife. Turn to Luke chapter 22 and verse 27. Because I want you to see that Christ's model of authority in that particular relationship is one of service. Luke 22:27 says, "For whether is greater, he that sitteth at meat, or he that serveth? Is not he that sitteth at meat? But I am among you as he that serveth." The next time you go to a restaurant and you sit down at the table and you're going to get ready to eat and the waiter comes over to ask you a question, remember this verse. Who's greater? The guy that's buying the meal or the one that's bringing it to him? On the social ladder, who's greater? If you go to a fine restaurant and sit down and order a steak or whatever, who's pictured as the greater in that scenario? You or the waiter that brings you the food? Well, obviously you, right? The waiter is a servant, and Christ is a servant in this relationship. Gentlemen, remember that. Don't take it to yourself that you can just run roughshod all over the top of your wife. Christ has never done that to the church. He even described in Luke chapter 12 and verse 37, he's described his second coming in terms of coming to serve. Luke 12:37 says, "Blessed are those servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you, that he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come forth and serve them." Now, a common source of conflict in marriage from the husband's side, because we tend to have thick skulls. I think that's where the term bonehead came from. It had to refer to a guy. I'm sure it never referred to a woman. But a common source of conflict is when the husband thinks what's best for the wife's well-being is in conflict with what the wife thinks is best for her well-being. I know that I fail often to put the seat down, but I also understand that it's better for my wife if I put the seat down. So I try to remember. Okay? It's not right for me to say, well, it's just as good for you with it up, because it's not. And I've come to learn the reason why. When you get into that type of a situation, remember that the husband better be guided by sober thought rather than his own base desires and emotions. I don't want to get into a bunch of weird things here. For those of you that are old enough, you're going to understand where I'm going. Don't make me get graphic. But don't ever, or let me rephrase that, always avoid impractical, unnecessary extremes in setting standards. Now this goes way beyond just whether she keeps the house clean or not. This moves over into the other parts of the house as well. Don't start asking for things that the wife is not willing to give. Don't do it. If she says no, No means no. Don't demand it. She's not forced to submit to that. And there have been issues in the past. I want you to understand that a calm and rational discussion between spouses might be needed when you get into those areas. And it's a good idea to listen. Turn to 1 Chronicles chapter 13. I want you to see that David did this. There have been times in the existence of my being pastor of this church that I've done this, and those of you that I've done it with know who you are. You know that from time to time I'll pick up the phone and call somebody and talk to them and ask them questions and have conversations with them. And what do you think is the best way to go with this? You know I've done it. Those of you that have been on the phone with me know I've done it. Sometimes that's the best thing to do. In 1 Chronicles chapter 13, it says, and David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds and with every leader. And David said unto all the congregation of Israel, if it seem good unto you, and that it be of the Lord our God, let us send abroad unto our brethren everywhere that are left in all the land of Israel, and with them also to the priests and Levites which are in the cities and suburbs, that they may gather themselves unto us, and let us bring again the ark of our God to us, for we inquired not as it in the days of Saul. And all the congregation said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. See, the Ark of the Covenant had been stolen. And so David went in and consulted with people rather than just doing it on his own. Sometimes that's important. Where a reasonable man has arrived at a reasonable conclusion, then the wife should submit. If it's a reasonable conclusion, submit to it. Because, see, that's one of those areas, now I'm going to pick on the wives for a second, but that's one of the areas that sometimes wives will get even. They'll decide to get even. And they won't submit even though the conclusion's reasonable, because it's payback time. For all the times that you guys didn't do what you were supposed to do, now comes payback time. Women don't do that. If it's reasonable, then submit to it. If it's not reasonable, then point out why it's not reasonable. Sometimes what a wife might perceive as a lack of love is actually a true demonstration of love. And he might be doing what he believes he's supposed to do in obedience to God. So listen about it, talk about it, find out, see where it stands, see if it's reasonable. Men, think not that she is my slave and my servant and my puppet and my push-button automation to satisfy every possible whim that I have. Don't think that. Not for a minute. Do think this. She's my beloved wife, my flesh, whom I nourish and cherish. Therefore, my rule and my control will be reasonable, benevolent, and with due consideration of her needs. I will be firm where household order or vital principle is at stake. I will establish guidelines and boundaries within which she may freely operate and exercise considerable power. I will not relinquish my headship, but neither will I be a heartless tyrant. I will remember my Savior's love for me, his tender, compassionate rule over me, and make this my pattern. If you can pattern your marriage that way, gentlemen, you'll be much better served and much happier. A man that thinks that he can dictate orders to his wife like a drill sergeant, grinding down boot camp recruits, not going to be very happy, because that kind of a man is a fool. And he'll likely generate alienation and mutiny. He's not going to get much respect. Certainly not going to get any loving submission. That's a destructive authority that will imperil the marriage and the family and the children and everybody else. By contrast, authority which manifests itself in loving consideration and care of a wife is far more likely to generate that loving submission that the husband needs in order to operate within the boundaries of God's rule. Now this passage in Ephesians 5 again starts off by saying husbands are to love their wives even as, that means in like manner as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for us. Christ's giving of himself for the church, we're told in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2, was a sacrifice to God. He gave himself to the church as a sacrifice to God. Ephesians 5:2, and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet smelling savor. Our trying to operate within the realm of what God has told us to do is seen by God as a sacrifice with a sweet smelling savor, so long as we operate correctly. If we attempt to love our wives as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, God is pleased by that. It's not something that's benign. He's watching. He sees. So know that he's watching and paying attention. That's looked upon as a sacrifice. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, we read, hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That's how we perceive the love of God. He laid down his life for us. Christ laid down his life for us. He gave his life for the church. He gave everything he had for the church. And in John chapter 15 and 13 it says, greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. There's no greater love than that. How many stories have been told? How many movies have been made? How many books have been written with the theme of a man giving of himself all the way to the point of death in some cases for the woman that he loves or for his friends? You can't turn the TV on without finding one. So as a result of that, I want you to think about something. This book and the gospel message that this book contains is the greatest love story ever told. Because Jesus Christ sacrificed himself all the way to death for the people in this room and the people in other rooms like this. For all of his elect, he gave his life to save them from what they deserved. He gave over and over to the point of death. Husbands, pay attention. Love your wives even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. After Christ's pattern of sacrifice, so is a man to love his wife at a cost to himself. And here's how he does it. You do it by giving her time, by giving her affection, by giving her attention, by giving her communication, by giving her appreciation, by giving her money, by giving her leisure, and by giving her yourself. That's how it's done. If you look at Song of Solomon, chapter 1 and verse 2, which is a picture of Jesus Christ and the church. Song of Solomon chapter 1 verse 2 says, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. Gentlemen, what do you think it is that your wife craves from you? your affection, your company. One of the things that I learned from my father in the ministry was that women and men are different. Well, I already knew that, but how they're different. And when he told me this, I looked at my wife, not looked at her, but I looked at how she operates within her world. We'd only been married for, I think Blake was a baby, so we'd only been married a little over a year. And it made me think of how it is that she, we go places when we go, and she's always picking up trinkets. The last trip we made, we have to apologize to the women of the church. She went out and got earrings, these little cheap earrings that they have at these places, to make sure that everybody got them. And she was wearing a set of them. And after about an hour or so, I looked over and I said, "Wendy, your neck's turning blue." Because whatever it was, so she didn't give them to anybody but the idea was, you see what women do? They work differently than men do. Men seem to think that if you hang around with them, well, we must be buds. That's how guys show affection. I'm around you. You ought to know. Well, that works with men. Men, it doesn't work with women. That doesn't tell them anything. You have to show women that you love them. Look at how women do things with their friends. They're all the time sending them cards, getting them little gifts, thinking of them, buying them this, buying them that little trinket. They do that all the time. That's how they show affection. So try showing them affection the way that they understand it. And it's not from just being there and thinking, well, that's good enough because I'm here. That must tell you that I love you. No, tell them that you love them. Say it. Utter the words. Let them know. Show them affection, compassion. Be with them. Communicate with them. And communication is not just verbal. Sometimes you can tell just by the way someone touches you on the shoulder, you're communicating with them. Wendy gets mad at me because I'm all the time playing with her hair. But I'm trying to communicate with her because that's how I communicate. You see, there's more to it than just showing up at 5 o'clock after work and demanding that there's food on the table. A lot more. That's not what Christ would have done. So think about that. In Song of Solomon chapter 2, verses 3 through 8, it says, "As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. I sat down under his shadow with great delight, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand doth embrace me. I charge you, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up nor wake my love till he please. The voice of my beloved, behold, he cometh leaping upon the mountains, skipping upon the hills." That's a picture that you should consider. And you can't do that if all you do is sit in front of a television and never talk to each other. There's more to it than that. A wife needs more from her husband than simply a paycheck. She needs to be told, she needs to be shown that she's loved, even as the church needs to be told and shown that Christ loves her. Think here of the personal value of Christ's love being communicated to us through the written word, through the preaching of the gospel, through the ordinances. All of those are designed to show us Christ's love. What would church be if all we did was just get together every Sunday and sat in a room together, stone quiet, and just sat there for an hour and a half, and then got up and left? Wouldn't be very fulfilling, would it? We don't come to church just to hang out with each other. We come to church to hear of the love of God for us, to hear the gospel. Husbands, pay attention, please. A husband should love his wife enough that if necessary, he would die for her. That's serious. And a man who's unwilling to sacrifice himself shouldn't marry. Not willing to do that, stay single. This is not a game. And a woman should never marry a man who only thinks of himself and what he wants, regardless of how good looking he is, regardless of how charming he is, regardless of how wealthy he is. If he's only concerned with himself, stay away. Run, Forrest, run. Because you're only signing up for trouble. Now, on the other hand, a husband's responsibility to love his wife does not cancel his responsibility to rule her as a head. You're still responsible to be the head of the household. God's still going to hold you responsible for the decisions that are made in your family. So, loving your wife does not mean always allowing her to have her way. If her way is wrong, you have to say no. You don't just turn into a yes man. That's not loving your wife. Because if you're a yes man and you always let her have her way, she just became the head of the family, did she not? She's just ruling through fiat, through you. So you're still responsible before God to be the head of the household. But remember that Christ loved the church sacrificially, not to exalt it over himself, but to save it. And that's how you should love your wife. Ephesians 5:27 says that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. That's the reason he gave himself for the church, to build the church into something that it wasn't before, to build it into something better, to make it, to lift it up. Back to that edification point. You should love your wife to lift her up, not to push her down. In Titus chapter 2 and verse 14 it says, who gave himself for us that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works. Peculiar. That word peculiar means one's own private property. Consider that, gentlemen. In Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 14, the church is called the purchased possession. If you give something for your wife, she's your wife. She is your possession, not from the standpoint of slavery, but she's still your possession. Your wife is your wife. And she should be, and in the right marriage, obviously is your most treasured possession on this earth. Aside from God, your wife should be the most precious thing you have. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, I want you to think about this verse, because Jesus Christ spent everything he had for the church. He left glory for her and came down here and took on human flesh. He preferred her to angels. He gave his life for her, and he made her his joint heir. Consider that when we're talking about the relationship between a husband and a wife. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, it says, "And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ, if so be that we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together." Think of what Christ gave for the church. Now look at your relationship with your wife. How do you line up? Can you line up better maybe in the future? Can you strive to maybe, none of us are perfect. I'm the farthest from it. Unfortunately, the longer I stay here, the worse I seem to get. I catch myself doing things constantly that 2 years ago wouldn't have bothered me, and now they drive me absolutely out of my mind. I just keep getting worse and worse and worse, and it's not just age. But as you grow, you just see more and more and more of the evil that you have within you. That's just the way it works. So I'll never be a perfect husband, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try. And the rest of you, I know you'll never be perfect husbands, but you should try. Just because you can't be one doesn't mean you ought to throw up your hands and quit. You ought to at least make a daily effort to try, because remember, God's pleased when you make that sacrifice. When you live, and one of the things that Conrad Jarrell used to always say, especially when there was a case of where a husband was mistreating his wife, one of the things that he would remind the husband of is, that's God's little girl. So be careful with her, because most fathers get ticked off if you mess with their little girls. So if nothing else teaches you the lesson, hang on to that one. Husbands should deem their wives their greatest possession. You know why? In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21, it says, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." We don't have many possessions in this earth that really mean that much. Your wife should be at the top of the list. After God, your wife should come first, gentlemen. And you should look at her that way, and you should consider her that way. A husband that loves his wife as Christ loved the church is not going to be a tyrant. He's not going to demand unreasonable things from her. He's going to take care of her. He's going to look out for her needs before he looks out for his own. That's extremely important. In his loving, sacrificing, and saving headship of his wife, Christ exalts her. Ephesians chapter 5, 26 and 7. That he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. That's Christ's relationship with the church. And gentlemen, that's a picture of you with your wife. You should lift her up. Christ doesn't trample on her. He doesn't debase her. He doesn't humiliate her. He doesn't insult her. The humiliation and the insult was his to bear. He bore it on the cross. He didn't pour it on her. Acts chapter 8 and verse 33 says, "In his humiliation, his judgment was taken away, and who shall declare his generation? For his life is taken from the earth." He gave everything for the church. And we should therefore give everything for our wives. And a godly man will follow Christ's example by exalting his wife through sacrificing of self-interest for his benefit. I know we all have things we want to do, but sometimes don't do what you want to do and do what she wants to do. Give in. It's not all about you. Consider your wife as Christ did the church. Don't exploit your headship to the humiliation of your wife. Your wife is to be honored. Turn to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, likewise ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life. Now watch this, that your prayers be not hindered. You know, it doesn't tell the wives to submit that your prayers be not hindered, but it does tell that to the husband. You want your prayers hindered, gentlemen? Don't love your wife. Don't pay attention to her needs. Look out only for yourself. They won't even make it through the ceiling tiles. That'll hinder your prayers faster than anything else. In Ephesians 5:27, we just looked at this. Remember, it says that he might present it to himself, a glorious church. That word present means to bring or place a person before into the presence of, or under the notice of. To introduce, especially formally or ceremoniously, to introduce at court or before a sovereign or another superior. You see, what Christ is doing is, his love for the church is bringing it to the notice of himself, presenting it so that he can present it. If you're going to take something and present it to someone, it's before you and you hand it to them, you show it to them, you show it off, you present it. You get the point, okay? Don't discount the importance of giving due attention to your wives. I can't tell you the number of marriages that end up on the rocks because the husband's never around. He's at work all the time. He never comes home. He doesn't spend any time with the wife. You probably know examples of that. They spend all their time out, they work all day, and then they go play golf in the afternoon, and then they have some sort of business dinner at night by themselves. And so they get up and they leave the house at 6 o'clock in the morning, and they roll back in at 9:30 at night, fall into bed, get up the next morning and do it all over again. And the only time they ever see their wife is when she rolls over because they landed in bed. That relationship ain't going to work. It's doomed from the get-go. Is that the picture that you would see of Christ loving the church? Does he only show up every once in a while? Does he stay gone most of the time? No. So give due consideration to this. And it also says in Ephesians 5:28 that men ought to love their wives as their own bodies. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. So means in the way or manner described, indicated, or suggested in that style of or fashion. Men ought to love their wives in the same way that Christ loved the church. We've already made that point. And a husband should give himself for his wife. A husband should present his wife to himself. He should bring her before his attention. He should so love his wife as to exalt her full potential. Not push her down, but lift her up. And when men love their wives as their own bodies, they love their wives as Christ loved the church. It's that simple. It's one of those golden rule things. If you just think of her as being part of you, well, then you're not going to do something to hurt yourself unless you need to go see a doctor. Men don't do things to hurt themselves unless they're sick in the head. Men shouldn't do things to hurt their wives. Now, unfortunately, as I said when we started this, we're all trapped within this sinful flesh that we can't get rid of. And so we tend to stumble a lot and we tend to forget what we're supposed to do. But we should at least know what we're supposed to do and go back and look at it from time to time. and pay close attention to what we should do, especially in the most important relationship that you're ever going to have on this earth, other than your relationship with God. For a man to love his wife as his own body is to bestow upon his wife the same care and consideration that he bestows upon his own flesh. Now that obviously assumes that he's bestowing a reasonable amount of care on his own flesh, right? That we have to make that assumption because some don't, but let's assume that. The man that doesn't care about his own body or mistreats it, he's still not justified in not caring for his wife. But watch that and mind this, that loving one's own body means putting a check on its desires for its own good. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27. First Corinthians 9:27 says, "But I keep under my body and bring it unto subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway." We all have desires that we know that, and we have liberty, but we know that we can't go too far with the liberty. And we know that there are some desires that we just have to stay away from altogether. We need to keep those under subjection. We need to take care of those things for our own body, and your wife is part of your own body. Don't ever lose sight of that. A man who loves his wife will, for her good, do likewise. It's not an act of nourishing or cherishing love to give into every desire of either one's body or of one's wife. And a man that thinks of his wife only as something that's going to feed him and comfort his body without bestowing the same regard for her does not love his wife as Christ also loved the church. And another important point, and that is that Paul teaches that in the marriage, the wife has power over the husband. She has power over the husband's body, and the husband has power over the wife's. You see, you don't even own yourself anymore. Once you're married and you get involved in that relationship, your wife has control over you, and you have control over the wife. But it has to be mutual. It has to be reasonable. I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. This will be our final verse. Believe it or not, we're going to wrap this thing up early. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 3 says, "Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence." Due, that means what's owing and payable is an enforceable obligation or a debt. Benevolence means favorable feeling or disposition as an emotion manifested towards another. Affection, goodwill towards a particular person or a particular occasion. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one another. Defraud means to deprive a person by fraud of that which is his by right, either by fraudulently taking or dishonestly withholding from him. Where to go here? Defraud ye not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your inconsistency. I think that's what that word says. So when it comes to that very special relationship between a husband and a wife, remember that. I'm not going to get into any more detail than that. But that is sometimes used as a way for one party to get their will when they don't have anything else to battle with. Don't defraud one another. Don't say no if there's no headache involved. And that's all I'm going to say regarding that. The husband, but by the same token, the husband should have the same regard for the needs of his wife as he expects for her to have for his needs. Okay? The husband should have the same regard for the wife's needs as he expects her to have regard for his. Now, question, men, you need respect, you need food, you need sex, you need liberty, and you need rest. Right? Those are things we need. I want you to understand your women need all those things too. They need every one of those things. And they also need affection, and they need attention, and they need appreciation, and they need assurance, and they need praise, and they need compassion, and they need kindness, and they need protection, and they need security, and they need stability, and all of these are a matter of due benevolence, and failure to render that benevolence to your wife is defrauding one's spouse. So we've covered a lot of ground in this, but with this we're going to close. And I've picked on wives for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I've picked on husbands for only 1, but I picked on them pretty good. And if you'll take these lessons and carry them forward in your marriage relationships, or if you're getting married, as we have one half of one couple in the church today, you'll be better suited with it, and it will help you through those times that you struggle, as we all do. So with that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention. Let's stand up and sing the first 3 verses of Amazing Grace. I believe that's number 154, I think. Yeah.